I'll pass it back to Mikey to talk about the third charter question, which is about the TDRP and whether to open it to registrants. Mikey.
Thanks, Lars. This is another one that's been a long time coming, and I have to admit that my view changed a bit on this one. Ever since way back in 2008 when we wrote these questions, I've been thinking, yeah, dang nabbit, why can't registrants initiate this when they're confronted by a recalcitrant registrar that just won't take up their banner? And so this is interesting. So here's the charter question. The question is whether dispute options for registrants should be developed and implemented as part of the policy. And then parenthetically it says, registrants currently depend on registrars to initiate a dispute on their behalf. And interestingly enough, the working group recommends that we not do that. And since I'm the registrant type guy on this call, let me explain what's going on there. Basically, registrants have several options to pursue disputes already. But one of the options that they don't have is to launch a transfer dispute resolution policy process. And the reason that we are not recommending that that be made available to registrants is because that process is really aimed at resolving a dispute between registrars. And if we inject the registrants into that process, it breaks it, basically. So what we are saying instead is that we wait, and that at least in terms of the current IRTP and the current TDRP, that registrants can't kick those off. The other recommendation we are making, though, is that we're referring back to the last IRTP, IRTPC, where we came up with the idea of an inter-registrant transfer as opposed to an inter-registrar transfer. And that recommendation is being implemented right now as we speak. And we aimed this other recommendation at that implementation process and said that the IRTPC inter-registrant transfer recommendation implementation should include appropriate dispute resolution mechanisms, and that if it doesn't, that we should launch another issue report to get that squared away in policy. But that by giving registrants access to what is really an inter-registrar process, we overload that process. And the working group doesn't think that's a good idea. Now, the third recommendation that we made is that right now the TDRP is a two-layer process. The first layer is the dispute between registrars is resolved by the registry. And then if that doesn't work out, the second level is taken to a dispute resolution provider. Times have changed. Back when this policy was written, there really were very few registry providers. And now, especially with the introduction of new GTLDs, there are going to be a lot of registry providers. At the same time, there are not very many TDRPs. I think the grand total is something on the order of 70. And it seems unreasonable to require every single registry to put in place a dispute resolution process that may never get used, or if it does get used, it's not going to get used very much. And so we're recommending that that layer be removed. Now, the group is pretty firm on that recommendation. We certainly want to hear from the community about that. What we're not quite so firm about is exactly how that works. So, for example, who pays if we take out one whole layer of this process? Right now, the way it works is that the second level is paid for like a dispute resolution process. Should that continue? Should it be changed? How do we mitigate against spurious, frivolous disputes, etc.? We're still really working on that, and we'd really like to hear from the community more on. We're assuming that the community will be okay with taking the layer out, although if you're uncomfortable with that, we certainly want to hear about that too. But what we really want to hear about is the mechanics and the roles and responsibilities and who bears the cost, because we haven't really got that one completely nailed down yet. James, you want to add on to any of all that blather? Sorry I went so long.
Well, thanks, Mikey. No, I think you covered it very well. And just to point out that this charter question consumed quite a bit of the working group's efforts. We spent a lot of time looking at all of the possibilities and all the different ways that we could develop a variation of this policy that was registrant initiated, and we kept running into these sort of deal breakers about what information they might have and what documentation might be available to registrants or authorizations or would be able to be done by the registrar. And so I think, as Mikey pointed out, when we look at this in the context of an inter-registrar process, the registrant really doesn't have all the pieces of the puzzle to make this dispute work. However, when we look at this as an inter-registrant transfer, which we are doing in the implementation of IRTPC, then it does make sense. So decoupling those two issues, the inter-registrar versus inter-registrant, makes more sense. And to your point about removing the first layer of the registries, I think absolutely correct. This is an extremely rare process. I think you said 70 times over the last 10 years it's been used, and that's not an even distribution. There's really only one or two TLDs that have seen any traffic in this policy at all. Most of the registries are really not seeing any disputes. They're either not being filed at the registry level, they're going directly to the second level, or they're taking some of these other avenues. So eliminating the first level, I think, will provide some consistency across the industry in where these disputes are heard and where they're resolved, and the precedents and standards that are used to review those cases for what we admit is an exceedingly rarely used policy. But we are looking for more feedback from the community, particularly, as Mikey mentioned, on the impact that would have towards fee structures.
Thank you very much, James and Mikey, for that overview of that charter question.